Jane and Abdion were a couple deeply in love. They met in Lagos, a bustling city full of energy and life. Lagos was where dreams came true, where the roads were always busy and people were always moving. But for Jane and Abdion, it was the place where they found something even more special, their love for each other. When Jane first saw Abdion, she felt something in her heart. It was like a little spark that made her smile. She didn't know him yet, but she felt like she already did. Abdion was tall and strong, with kind eyes that always seemed to be smiling. He had a way of making people feel comfortable around him, and Jane was no exception. She found herself thinking about him long after they first met. Abdion noticed Jane too. She had a gentle way about her, with a smile that made the whole world seem brighter. Her laughter was like a music, soft and sweet, and Abdion found himself wanting to hear it more and more. He knew right away that Jane was special, and he wanted to get to know her better. As they spent more time together, their feelings for each other grew stronger. They went on walks through the busy streets of Lagos, talking about everything under the sun. They shared stories about their childhoods, their dreams for the future, and the things they cared about most. They laughed a lot, and sometimes they just sat quietly, enjoying each other's company. One day, while they were sitting by the water, watching the waves crash against the shore, Abdion looked at Jane and knew he wanted to spend the rest of his life with her. He turned to her and said, Jane, I love you. I want to be with you forever. Will you marry me? Jane's heart skipped a beat. She looked into Abdion's eyes and saw the love he had for her. With a big smile, she said, Yes, Abdion, I love you too, and I want to be with you always. And so, they got married. Their wedding was a simple one, just the way they liked it. They didn't need a big party or fancy decorations. All they needed was each other and the love they shared. They stood before their family and friends, holding hands, and promised to love and support each other for the rest of their lives. The years went by, and their love only grew stronger. They built a life together in Lagos, creating a home filled with laughter, love, and happiness. They were partners in everything they did, always there for each other, no matter what. But there was one thing that hadn't happened yet. They hadn't had a child. Jane and Abdion had talked about having children when they first got married. They both loved kids and dreamed of starting a family. But as the years passed, they hadn't been able to have a baby. For some couples, this might have been a problem. They might have worried or felt sad about not having a child. But for Jane and Abdion, it was never an issue. They knew that their love for each other was the most important thing. They were happy just being together, sharing their lives and supporting one another. One evening, while they were sitting in their cozy living room, Abdion turned to Jane and said, Jane, do you ever feel sad that we haven't had a child? Jane thought for a moment and then smiled. Abdion, I'm happy as long as I'm with you. Our love is enough for me. If a child comes into our lives one day, that would be wonderful. But if not, I'm still the luckiest person in the world because I have you. As the years passed, the love between Jane and Abdion remained strong. They continued to support each other, share their lives, and spread love to those around them. But as time flew by, Abdion began to notice small changes in his wife. These changes were so subtle at first that he hardly paid attention to them. But as time went on, they became harder to ignore. Jane, who had always been cheerful and full of energy, started to seem distant. She began coming home late than usual, and sometimes she didn't seem like her usual self. Abdion would prepare dinner, waiting for her to arrive, but she often called to say she would be late. When she finally came home, she looked tired and distracted. Not the same Jane who used to light up the room with her smile. "Jane, is everything okay?" Abdion asked one evening as they sat down to dinner. He had noticed that she had been quiet all day, not her usual talkative self. Jane looked up from her plate and forced a smile. "Yes, everything is fine, Abdion. Just a lot of work, that's all." Abdion nodded, though he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He didn't want to push her, so he let it go, hoping that whatever was bothering her would pass. But as days turned into weeks, Jane's behavior became even more puzzling. She started spending a lot of time on her phone, talking to someone Abdion didn't know. She would step out of the room when the phone rang, speaking in hushed tones, as if she didn't want him to hear. Sometimes, she would be on the phone late at night, long after Abdion had gone to bed. That evening, as they were sitting together in the living room, Jane's phone rang again. She glanced at the screen and quickly stood up. "I need to take this," she said, heading for the door. Abdion watched her leave, a knot forming in his stomach. He had always trusted Jane completely, but now he couldn't help but wonder who she was talking to. Why was she being so secretive? Why was she acting so differently? Despite these troubling thoughts, Abdion never questioned her. He didn't want to seem like he didn't trust her. He loved Jane more than anything and didn't want to cause any troubles between them. So, he kept his worries to himself, hoping that whatever was going on would sort itself out. But as time went on, the changes in Jane became more noticeable. She started going out more often, leaving the house without telling Abdion where she was going. Sometimes, she wouldn't come home until very late at night. When Abdion asked where she had been, Jane would give vague answers, saying she had been with friends or running errands. That night, after Jane had come home late, Abdion decided to ask her about it. He didn't want to make her feel uncomfortable, but he needed to know what was going on. He trusted Jane, and he didn't want to make her feel like he was doubting her. But the late night continued, and so did the phone calls. Jane would be on the phone for hours, talking to the same mysterious person. Abdion could hear her voice from the other room, but he couldn't make out what she was saying. It was as if a wall had been built between them, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't break through it. One afternoon, as Abdion was sitting on the couch reading a book, he noticed Jane pacing back and forth in the kitchen, her phone pressed to her ear. She was speaking in a low voice, her face tense with worry. Abdion tried not to listen, but he couldn't help but overhear snippets of the conversation. "I can't talk right now." The words sent a chill down Abdion's spine. Who was Jane talking to? And what was she hiding from him? That night, as they lay in bed, Abdion stared at the ceiling, his mind racing with questions. He didn't know what was going on with Jane, but he knew that something wasn't right. He could feel the distance growing between them, like a shadow that was slowly creeping into their lives. He turned to Jane, who was lying beside him, with her back turned. Jane, he said softly, are you sure everything is okay? You have been so distant lately. I miss the way things used to be between us. Jane didn't respond right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I'm sorry, Abdion. I'm just going through a lot right now. Please be patient with me. Jane had never imagined that her life would take such a turn. She had been married to Abdion for 5 years, and while their marriage had its ups and downs, she never thought she would find herself entangled in an affair. But here she was, caught up in a web of secrets and lies, all because of a man named Johnson. It all began one ordinary day when Johnson arrived in Lagos for a business trip. He was a tall, handsome man with a charming smile and a confidence that could easily draw anyone in. Johnson was from the United States, where he had a wife and a young son named Ezra. His life back home was comfortable, but when he landed in Lagos, something unexpected happened. Johnson was supposed to be in Lagos for just a short while. He had business meetings lined up, and he planned to return home as soon as his work was done. But then he met Jane. It was in a small cafe near his hotel where they first crossed paths. Jane was there having a quiet lunch, and Johnson, looking for a place to sit, noticed the empty seat at her table. Is this seat taken? Johnson asked, smiling down at her. Jane looked up, slightly startled by the stranger's presence. Oh, no, it's not. Please have a seat. As Johnson settled into the chair, they exchanged polite smiles. At first, their conversation was light, just small talk about the weather and how busy the city was. But there was something about Johnson that drew Jane in. He was easy to talk to, and before long, they were laughing and sharing stories. Johnson told her about his work and how he traveled often. He never mentioned his family, and Jane never told him that she already married. As they talked, there was an undeniable chemistry between them. Johnson found himself captivated by Jane's beauty and charm, while Jane was drawn to Johnson's confidence and the way he made her feel special. When it was time for them to part ways, they exchanged phone numbers, agreeing to keep in touch during Johnson's stay in Lagos. At first, their communication was innocent enough. They texted back and forth, sharing jokes and talking about their days. But as time passed, their messages became more frequent and more personal. Johnson found himself looking forward to hearing from Jane, and Jane couldn't deny the excitement she felt every time her phone buzzed with a new message from him. It wasn't long before their conversations took a turn. The playful banter turned into flirtation, and the boundaries that should have been respected started to blur. Jane knew she was crossing a line, but she couldn't help herself. There was something about Johnson that made her feel alive in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. One evening, Johnson invited Jane to dinner. It was meant to be a simple meal, just two friends catching up. But deep down, they both knew it was more than that. Jane hesitated at first, knowing that meeting Johnson in such a setting would only complicate things further. But the pull was too strong, and she found herself agreeing. They met at a quiet, dimly lit restaurant, far from the bustling streets of Lagos. As they sat across each other, the tension between them was palpable. They talked, laughed, and enjoyed each other's company. but there was an underlying current of attraction that neither could ignore. As the evening drew to a close, Johnson reached across the table and took Jane's hand in his. "I know this might sound crazy," he said, his voice soft, "but I can't stop thinking about you, Jane." Jane's heart raced as she looked into Johnson's eyes. She knew what he was implying, and part of her wanted to pull away, to end this before it went too far. But another part of her, the part that craved the attention and excitement, couldn't resist. "Johnson," she began, trying to find the right words. "We shouldn't be doing this." "I know," Johnson replied, his grip on her tightening slightly. "But I can't help how I feel. Being with you, it feels right." Jane felt a whirlwind of emotions swelling inside her. She knew this was wrong, that she was betraying her husband and everything they had built together. But there was something intoxicating about the way Johnson made her feel, cherished and desired. That night, as they left the restaurant, Johnson and Jane walked into the car and they drove off to the hotel. As the soft lights of the hotel room cast a warm glow around them, Jane and Johnson found themselves unable to resist the pull of their emotions. They both knew that what they were doing was wrong, that they were crossing a line they shouldn't. But that moment, the world outside seemed to disappear, and all that mattered was the connection they felt with each other. Johnson reached out and gently took Jane's hand, his eyes filled with a mixture of longing and sadness. "Jane," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "I don't want to say goodbye. Not like this." Jane felt a lump form in her throat as she looked into Johnson's eyes. She knew that after tonight, everything would change. She would go back to her life with Abdion, and Johnson would return to his family in the States. But for now, in this moment, she wanted to hold on to the feeling of being with someone who made her feel special. Without saying another word, Jane stepped closer to Johnson, and he pulled her into his arms. The room was quiet, save for the distant sounds of the city outside. And for a moment, they just stood there, holding each other as if they were the only two people in the world. Johnson gently tilted Jane's chin up, and their eyes met. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. He didn't want to push her into something she wasn't ready for. Jane nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. "I'm sure," she whispered back. She knew this was a moment she would never forget. And even though it was wrong, it felt right. With that, Johnson leaned down and pressed his lips to hers in a tender, lingering kiss. The kiss quickly deepened, and all the pent-up emotion they had been holding back came rushing to the surface. As they held each other close, the world outside the hotel room faded away, leaving only the two of them lost in each other's embrace. Time seemed to stand still as they made their way to the bed, their hands exploring each other's bodies with a mixture of urgency and tenderness. For that one night, they allowed themselves to forget about the consequences, about the people they were betraying, and simply gave in the passion they had been trying to deny. The night was filled with whispered confessions, stolen kisses, and the sound of their hearts beating in unison. In the darkness of the hotel room, they found solace in each other, even though they both knew that this would be their last time together. As the night wore on, they finally drifted off to sleep, wrapped in each other's arms. The weight of what they had done hung heavy in the air. but neither of them was ready to face it just yet. The next morning, Jane woke up to find the room battered in the soft light of dawn. For a moment, she forgot where she was, but the reality of the situation quickly came crashing down on her as she realized she was alone in the bed. The spot where Johnson had lain was empty, and the sheets were cold. Panic set in as Jane sat up, looking around the room for any sign of Johnson. But there was nothing, no note, no message, nothing to indicate where he had gone. Her heart raced as she tried to make sense of what had happened. Had Johnson really left without saying goodbye? She quickly got out of bed and rushed to the window, hoping to catch a glimpse of him leaving the hotel. But the streets below were already bustling with people starting their day. Johnson was nowhere to be seen. Jane's mind raced and she tried to piece together the events of the night before. Had she said something to make him leave? Or he had simply decided that it was better to end things this way without any final words. She felt a mix of emotions: anger, confusion, sadness, but most of all, she felt a deep sense of loss. She had known from the start that this affair couldn't last, but she had never imagined that it would end so abruptly without any closure. She had known from the start that this was going to end, but she hadn't expected it to hurt this much. She had let herself fall for Johnson, even though she knew it was wrong, and now she was paying the price. With a heavy heart, Jane got dressed and gathered her things. She knew she couldn't stay in the hotel room any longer. She had to go back to her life, to Abdion, and pretend that none of this had ever happened. But the memory of the night and the way Johnson had made her feel would stay with her forever. As she left the hotel, Jane couldn't help but look back one last time, hoping to see Johnson walking towards her, ready to explain why he had left so suddenly. But the street was empty, and the only thing she had left of him was his watch. Johnson, meanwhile, was already on his way to the airport. He had left the hotel early, not wanting to face the difficult goodbye he knew would come if he stayed. He had made the decision to leave without telling Jane because he knew that if he looked into her eyes one more time, he wouldn't be able to walk away. As his plane took off, Johnson stared out the window, his thoughts filled with memory of the night they had spent together. He knew he had made a mistake, that he had let his emotions get the better of him. But there was no going back now. He had a family waiting for him in the States, and he had to return to them. A few weeks had passed since that fateful night at the hotel, and life in Lagos was beginning to return to its usual routine for Jane and Abdion. On the surface, everything seemed normal. Jane went about her daily activities, and Abdion continued with his work. But beneath the calm exterior, Jane was battling an inner turmoil that she couldn't ignore. It all started one morning when Jane woke up feeling uneasy. At first, she thought it was just a simple case of food poisoning, something she could brush off and move on from. But as the days went by, the sickness didn't go away. Instead, it grew worse, accompanied by fatigue and dizziness. Jane's heart sank as she realized what these symptoms could mean. One quiet afternoon, while Abdion was at work, Jane sat alone in their living room, the weight of her thoughts pressing down on her. She couldn't avoid the truth any longer. She was pregnant. But the baby wasn't Abdion's. It was Johnson's. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks, and she felt her stomach churn, not just from the pregnancy, but from the guilt and fear that came with it. Jane knew she had to act fast. Abdion was a smart man, and she couldn't risk him finding out the truth. She needed a plan, a way to make Abdion believe that the baby was his. But how? They hadn't been intimate in months, and Abdion would surely notice if she suddenly tried to get close to him now. As Jane sat there, her mind raced through the possibilities. She knew she had to be careful to make everything seem as natural as possible. She decided that the first step was to rekindle their physical relationship. If she could convince Abdion that their marriage was back on track, it would be easier to pass off the pregnancy as his. That evening, when Abdion came home from work, Jane greeted him with a warm smile, trying to push her nerves aside. "Welcome home, honey," she said, wrapping her arms around him in a hug. Abdion hugged her back, but Jane could sense the hesitation in his embrace. He had noticed the distance between them over the past few months, and she knew she had to be convincing. "How was work today?" Jane asked, trying to keep her tone light and casual. "Busy as usual," Abdion replied, his voice tired. He walked over to the dining table and sat down, loosening his tie. "But I'm glad to be home." Jane took a deep breath, trying to muster the courage to put her plan into action. She walked over to him and placed a hand on his shoulder. "I have missed you," she said softly, hoping her words would bridge the gap that had grown between them. Abdion looked up at her, his eyes searching hers for sincerity. "I have missed you too," he said, though his tone was cautious. He wanted to believe her, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As the evening went on, Jane tried to be as attentive and affectionate as possible. She cooked his favorite meal, laughed at his jokes, and even suggested they watch a movie together, something they hadn't done in a long time. Abdion went along with it, though he couldn't help but feel that Jane's sudden change in behavior was too good to be true. Later that night, as they got ready for bed, Jane knew it was now or never. She needed to take the next step in her plan. She slipped into bed beside Abdion, her heart pounding in her chest. She reached out and placed a hand on his arm, hoping to signal that she wanted to be close to him. Abdion turned to look at her, his brow furrowed. "Jane, is everything okay?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Jane forced a smile, even though she felt like she was about to break down. "Everything is fine, honey," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. I just want us to be close again. I have missed this." Abdion's eyes softened, but there was still a hint of doubt in his expression. "I have missed you too," he said, though his tone was cautious. He gently reached out and touched her cheek, his thumb brushing against her skin. "But we haven't been like this in a long time, Jane. What's changed?" Jane's mind raced as she tried to come up with an explanation. She knew she had to be careful with her words. "I have been thinking a lot lately," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "about us, about our marriage. I know I have been distant, and I am sorry. I want to make things right." Abdion studied her face, searching for any sign of deception. He wanted to believe her, but he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was wrong. Still, he didn't want to push her away, especially if she was making an effort to reconnect. "I want that too," he finally said, pulling her into a gentle embrace. Jane felt a wave of relief wash over her as she rested her head against Abdion's chest. She knew this was only the first step, but it was a crucial one. If she could convince him that their relationship was improving, it would be easier to explain the pregnancy when the time came. Over the next few days, Jane continued her efforts to get closer to Abdion. She planned romantic dinners, suggested weekend getaways, and tried to create moments of intimacy between them. But despite her best efforts, there was always a part of her that felt like she was walking on a tightrope, constantly on the verge of slipping and revealing the truth. Abdion, for his part, tried to go along with Jane's newfound affection. He wanted to believe that they were turning a corner in their marriage, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He noticed that Jane seemed nervous, almost as if she was trying too hard to be the perfect wife. As the days passed, Jane's anxiety only grew. She knew that she was running out of time to put her plan into action. Soon, it would be impossible to hide her pregnancy, and she would have to find a way to explain it to Abdion. But no matter how hard she tried to prepare herself, the thought of lying to him made her stomach turn. One night, as she lay in bed beside Abdion, unable to sleep, Jane stared up at the ceiling, her mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. She had never imagined that things would get this complicated, and now she was trapped in a web of her own making. Finally, after what felt like hours, Jane made a decision. She would try to sleep with Abdion to cover up the truth. It was a risky move, but it was the only option she had left. If she could time it right, Abdion would never know that the child wasn't his. The next morning, Jane put her plan into motion. She made an effort to be even more affectionate with Abdion, hoping to entice him into bed with her. But as the days went by, it became clear that Abdion wasn't as easily swayed as he had hoped. One night, as Jane tried to initiate intimacy, Abdion gently pulled away, a look of concern on his face. "Jane," he said softly, "I can't do it, and that's on period." Jane's plan was failing. Despite her best efforts, Abdion remained distant, refusing to sleep with her no matter how hard she tried to draw him close. It seemed like the bond between them, once strong, had frayed beyond repair. Night after night, she would reach out to him, but he would gently pull away, leaving her feeling more desperate with each passing day. The tension in the house was palpable. Jane could feel Abdion's eyes on her, watching her closely, as if he knew something was wrong, but couldn't quite put his finger on it. She tried to act normal, to keep up the pretense that everything was fine, but the weight of her secret was becoming too much to bear. Days went by, and Jane's anxiety grew with each day. The pregnancy was progressing, and soon it would be impossible to hide. She knew she had to do something before it was too late, but nothing was working. Abdion's refusal to be intimate with her meant that her plan to pin the pregnancy on him was falling apart. One morning, the stress of it all finally took its toll on her body. Jane woke up feeling weaker than usual, a light headache that she couldn't shake off. She tried to get out of bed, but as soon as she stood up, the room spun around her and her legs gave way. She collapsed to the floor, her vision blurring as she tried to call out for help. "Jane!" Abdion's voice rang out from the other room. He had heard the thud and rushed to her side. Seeing her pale and unresponsive on the floor sent a wave of panic through him. Without wasting a second, he scooped her up in his arms and carried her to the car. His heart raced as he sped towards the hospital, his mind filled with fear and worry. At the hospital, the doctors quickly took Jane into the emergency room, leaving Abdion to pace the hallway, his mind racing with all sorts of terrible possibilities. What if something was seriously wrong with her? What if she didn't recover? He couldn't bear the thought of losing her, despite everything that had happened between them. After what felt like an eternity, a doctor finally emerged from the room. Abdion rushed over, his heart pounding in his chest. Doctor, how is she? Is she going to be okay? The doctor gave him a reassuring smile. She's stable now, Mr. Abdion. Your wife had a fainting spell, but she's recovering. We have done some tests and everything seems to be normal. Abdion let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. Relief washing over him. Thank God, he whispered, his hands trembling slightly. There is something you should know, though, the doctor continued, his tone more serious now. Your wife is pregnant. Congratulations. The words hit Abdion like a bolt of lightning. Pregnant? He repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. He stared at the doctor, his mind struggling to process the information. It didn't make any sense. They hadn't been intimate in months. So, how could she be pregnant? Yes, the doctor confirmed. She's about 10 weeks along, which means she's nearing the end of her first trimester. It's important for her to get plenty of rest and to come in for regular checkups. Abdion nodded numbly, his thoughts spinning out of control. As the doctor walked away, he leaned against the wall, trying to make sense of what he had just heard. Jane was pregnant, but not by him. The truth was staring him in the face, but he wasn't ready to accept it. He wanted to believe that there was some mistake, some explanation that would make everything okay. But deep down, he knew. He knew that the child growing inside Jane wasn't his, and the realization cut him to the core. When Jane finally woke up, she found herself in a hospital bed, the bright light above her making her squint. She turned her head to see Abdion sitting by her side, his expression unreadable. Her heart sank as she saw the look in his eyes, a mix of confusion, hurt, and something else she couldn't quite place. Abdion, she began, her voice weak. What happened? Why am I here? You fainted, Abdion replied, his tone flat. I brought you to the hospital. The doctor said you are pregnant. The color drained from Jane's face as the reality of the situation hit her. She had been so careful, so determined to hide the truth, but now it was all unraveling right before her eyes. Abdion, Jane, Abdion interrupted, his voice low but firm. Tell me the truth. How far along are you? Jane hesitated, her mind racing for an excuse, but she knew there was no point in lying anymore. Abdion was too smart for that. 10 weeks, she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Abdion's jaw tightened as he absorbed the information. 10 weeks, he repeated, his voice filled with a mixture of disbelief and anger. We haven't been together in months, Jane. So how is it possible that you are pregnant? Jane looked away, tears welling up in her eyes. She couldn't bring herself to look him in the eyes as she confessed the truth. Abdion, I'm so sorry, she whispered, her voice trembling. I never meant for this to happen. Abdion's heart sank as the truth finally came out. He had suspected it for a while, but hearing it from Jane's own lips made it all the more real. The woman he loved, the woman he had trusted with all his heart, had betrayed him. And now she was carrying another man's child. Who is he? Abdion asked, his voice tight with emotion. Who is the father? Jane swallowed hard, the name of her lover almost catching in her throat. His name couldn't come out of her mouth. Abdion closed his eyes, feeling a wave of pain and anger wash over him. He had known that something was off, that Jane had been hiding something from him, but he had never imagined it would be this. The betrayal cut deep, and for a moment, he didn't know what to say or do. You have been lying to me, he finally said, his voice thick with emotion. All this time, you have been lying to me. How could you do this, Jane? How could you betray me like this? Jane's tears spilled over, running down her cheeks as she struggled, to find the words to explain herself. I'm so sorry, Abdion, she sobbed. I never meant to hurt you. I was weak, and I made a terrible mistake. Please forgive me. Abdion shook his head, his heart aching with the weight of her betrayal. How can I forgive you, Jane? He asked, his voice breaking. You have shattered everything we had. How can I ever trust you again? Jane reached out to him, desperate to make things right, but Abdion pulled away. The pain too fresh, too raw. Abdion, please, she pleaded. I will do anything to make it up to you. Just don't leave me. But Abdion couldn't hear her words through the fog of his own pain. The woman he loved, the woman he had built his life with, had destroyed everything. And now, he was left to pick up the pieces of a marriage that had been shattered beyond repair. As he stood up and walked out of the hospital room, leaving Jane behind, Abdion knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The truth had come out, and there was no going back. The life they had built together was over, and all that was left was the bitter taste of betrayal. After that day at the hospital, Jane and Abdion's marriage was never the same. The trust between them was completely broken, and they both knew that there was no way to repair it. Despite the tears, apologies, and attempts to make things right, the damage was so deep. They agreed to file for divorce, knowing it was the only way to move forward. The legal process was tough and draining, but it was the final step in ending what had once been a loving marriage. Jane moved out, taking with her the memories of their 5 years together, now tainted by the betrayal that had torn them apart. As the weeks turned into months, Jane's pregnancy progressed. She was alone, facing the reality of being a single mother. Abdion had made it clear that he wanted nothing to do with the child, and Jane understood why. The baby was a constant reminder of her mistake, of the affair with Johnson that had destroyed everything. But despite the guilt and the loneliness, Jane was determined to do her best for her unborn child. Months later, Jane gave birth to a beautiful baby girl. She named her Ella. From the moment Ella was born, Jane's life changed completely. She poured all her love and energy into raising her daughter, doing everything she could to give Ella the best life possible. As Ella grew up, she became the center of Jane's world. Jane worked hard, taking on multiple jobs to support them. She was determined to provide for Ella and ensure that she had everything she needed, even though it meant sacrificing her own dreams and desires. It wasn't easy, but Jane found strength in the love she had for her daughter. Every smile, every laugh from Ella was worth the sleepless nights and long hours of work. Jane taught Ella to be strong, independent, and kind. She made sure that Ella knew the importance of hard work and resilience. As a single mother, Jane had to be both a mother and a father to Ella, and she took on that role with pride. She taught Ella how to ride a bike, helped her with her homework, and cheered her on at every school event. Ella grew up knowing that her mother was always there for her no matter what. When Ella started school, Jane made sure to be involved in her education. She attended parent-teacher meetings, helped with school projects, and made sure that Ella had everything she needed to succeed. As Ella moved from primary school to secondary school, Jane continued to be her biggest supporter, always encouraging her to do her best. Years passed, and soon, Ella was ready to go to the university. Jane was incredibly proud of her daughter. She had grown into a smart, kind, and capable young woman. Ella had worked hard to get a good grade and was accepted into one of the top universities in the country. It was a bittersweet moment for Jane, who knew that Ella's university years would mark the beginning of a new chapter in both of their lives. On Ella's first day at university, Jane helped her settle into her new dorm room. As they unpacked boxes and arranged the small space, Jane couldn't help but feel a mixture of pride and sadness. She was proud of Ella for reaching this milestone, but she also knew that she would miss having her daughter at home every day. Mom, I'm going to be fine, Ella said, noticing the look on Jane's face. You have prepared me for this. I will call you every day, I promise. Jane smiled, brushing a tear from her eye. I know you will, Ella. I'm just going to miss you, that's all. But I'm so proud of you. You are going to do amazing things here. After making sure Ella was settled in, Jane hugged her tightly before saying goodbye. As she drove away from the university, Jane felt a mix of emotions. She was happy that Ella was starting this new chapter of her life, but she also felt the weight of the years that had passed. Being a single mother had been challenging, but she couldn't trade a single moment of it. Ella was everything to her, and seeing her succeed was the greatest reward. Ella quickly adapted to university life. She made friends, joined clubs, and threw herself into her studies. She loved the independence and the excitement of being in a new environment. But despite all the new experiences, she always made time to call her mother, just as she promised. One day, while walking to one of her classes, Ella bumped into a young man who was also hurrying to class. Books and papers went flying, and they both laughed as they bent down to pick them up. Sorry about that, Ella said with a smile as she handed him one of his books. No worries, the young man replied, smiling back. I wasn't looking where I was going. They introduced themselves, and that's how Ella met Ezra. They quickly became friends, bonding over their shared classes and interests. Ezra was kind, funny, and easy to talk to. Over time, their friendship grew stronger, and they began spending more time together. They studied together, ate meals together, and talked about everything under the sun. One afternoon, as they were sitting on a bench outside the university, Ezra shared a bit about his family. I have a younger brother and a sister, he said, but they are back home in the States with my dad. He travels a lot for work, so I don't see them as much as I would like to. Ella listened intently, curious about Ezra's life. Do you miss them? She asked. Yeah, I do, Ezra admitted, but we stay in touch. My dad, he's always busy with work, but he's a good guy. He's been through a lot, especially with his marriage. It didn't work out and he ended raising us on his own for a while. But my mom, well, she returned later. They all stayed together in the States. Ella nodded, thinking about her own mother and the sacrifices she had made. My mom, she raised me on her own too, she said. It's not easy, but she did an amazing job. I owe everything to her. Ezra smiled, appreciating the bond Ella had with her mother. Single moms are incredible, he said. They are real life superheroes. As their friendship deepened, Ella and Ezra began to realize that they had more in common than they initially thought. Although they had different backgrounds, their experiences had shaped them into the people they were today. One evening, as they sat together in the university courtyard, Ella looked at Ezra and felt a connection she hadn't felt with anyone else. There was something special about him, something that made her feel understood and accepted. Ezra, she began hesitantly. I feel like we were meant to meet. It's strange, but I have never felt this way about anyone before. Ezra looked into Ella's eyes, feeling the same way. I feel the same way, Ella. Meeting you has been the best thing that has happened to me since I got here. Ella and Ezra's relationship grew stronger with each passing day. They were the kind of couple that everyone admired, always laughing, always supporting each other, and always dreaming of the future they would build together. From the moment they met, it felt like they were meant to be. Ezra was not just a boyfriend to Ella, he was her best friend. They shared everything: hopes, dreams, fears, and secrets. Ella often talked about her mother, Jane, and how much she admired her for raising her alone. Ezra, in turn, shared stories about his father and siblings. Even though they had different upbringings, they understood each other perfectly. As time passed, it became clear to both Ella and Ezra that their relationship was not just a passing phase. They were in love and wanted to spend the rest of their lives together. Ezra adored Ella, and she felt the same way about him. In Ella's final year at the university, they began talking about marriage, and the thought of becoming husband and wife filled them with excitement. Ella, I can't wait for you to meet my family, Ezra said one evening as they walked hand in hand through the university campus. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over everything. It was one of those perfect moments that made them feel like nothing in the world could go wrong. Ella smiled, leaning her head on Ezra's shoulder. I can't wait either. I want to meet the people who raised such an amazing person. I know your father must be incredible. Ezra nodded. He is. My dad has been through a lot, but he's always been there for us. I think he will really like you, Ella. You two would get along well. Ella felt a warmth in her heart at the thought. She had always wanted to be part of a big loving family, and now that dream was within reach. And my mom will be so happy when she meets you, Ella said. She already likes you so much. She always says that I'm lucky to have found someone like you. Ezra laughed. I'm the lucky one, Ella. You have brought so much joy into my life. They continued to talk about their future, making plans for their wedding, their home, and even the children they hope to have one day. It was all so perfect, like a dream come true. They decided that after graduation, they would visit Ezra's family in the United States to introduce Ella and get their marriage plans started. When Ella told her mother Jane about the trip, Jane was thrilled. She had always wanted the best for her daughter, and seeing Ella so happy made her heart swell with pride. Jane had met Ezra several times, and she was impressed by his manners, his intelligence, and the way he treated Ella with such love and respect. Ella, I think you have found a good man, Jane said one afternoon as they sat together in the living room, sipping tea. Ezra seems like the kind of person who will always stand by you, no matter what. Ella beamed. I know, Mom. He's everything I have ever wanted and more. I'm so excited to meet his family and start planning our future together. Jane reached over and squeezed her daughter's hand. I'm so happy for you, Ella. You deserve all the happiness in the world. As the day of the trip approached, Ella couldn't contain her excitement. She and Ezra packed their bags, booked their flight, and made all necessary arrangements. Everything was falling into place perfectly, just as they had hoped. The day of the trip arrived. Jane, Ella, and Ezra boarded the plane with hearts full of excitement and anticipation. Ella looked out the window as the plane took off, imagining what it would be like to finally meet Ezra's family. She was nervous but also thrilled at the thought of starting this new chapter in her life. After a long flight, they arrived in the United States. Ezra's family lived in a beautiful neighborhood, and as they drove through the tree-lined street, Jane felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. She had heard so much about Ezra's father, and she couldn't wait to meet him. Ezra, Ella said, her eyes shining with happiness. I can't wait to meet your family. I'm sure they will love me. Ezra smiled, taking her hand in his. I know they will, Ella. My parents are really excited to meet you too. They have heard so much about you. Ella nodded, feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness. She had spoken to Ezra's mother on the phone a few times, and they got along well, but meeting Ezra's father was something she had been looking forward to. Ezra often spoke about how his father was a hardworking and dedicated man, and Ella wanted to make a good impression. As they drove towards Ezra's house, Ella's eyes widened. "This place is so beautiful," she said, taking in the surroundings. Ezra smiled. "I knew you would like it. My dad loves this neighborhood. He says it's peaceful and a great place to raise a family." Ella nodded, her excitement growing. She couldn't wait to meet Ezra's parents and see where he had grown up. As they approached the house, her heart started to beat faster. The house was large and elegant, with a well manicured lawn and flowers lining the walkway. When they finally arrived, Ezra parked the car and turned to Ella and Jane. "Are you ready?" he asked, a hint of nervousness in his voice. Ella nodded, taking a deep breath. "Yes, let's go." They got out of the car and walked up to the front door. Ezra knocked, and after a few moments, the door opened to reveal a tall, handsome man with a warm smile. "Ezra!" the man exclaimed, pulling Ezra into a hug. "It's so good to see you, my son." Ezra grinned. "Good to see you too, Dad. I would like you to meet Ella, and this is her mother, Jane." Johnson turned to Ella and Jane, his smile still in place. "Welcome to our home," he said, shaking their hands. "We have heard a lot about you." As Johnson shook Jane's hand, something strange happened. Their eyes met, and for a moment, both of them froze. It was as if time stood still. Jane's heart skipped a beat as she recognized the man standing before her. It was Johnson, the man she had once had an affair with, the father of her daughter's boyfriend. She could see the shock in his eyes as well. Ella, oblivious to the tension between them, smiled brightly. "It's so nice to finally meet you, Mr. Johnson. Ezra has told me so much about you." Johnson managed to recover, forcing a smile as he turned to Ella. "It's nice to meet you too, Ella," he said, his voice slightly strained. "I'm sure you and Ezra are very happy together." Ezra's mother, who had been in the kitchen, came out to greet them as well. "Welcome, welcome," she said, hugging Ella and Jane. "I'm so glad you are here." Jane tried to keep her composure as they all went inside. Her mind was racing, and she couldn't believe what was happening. How could it be that the man her daughter was in love with was the son of the man she had once been involved with? She felt like the ground was shifting beneath her feet, but she knew she had to stay calm for Ella's sake. As they sat down in the living room, Johnson and Jane avoided looking at each other, both of them struggling with the realization of what was happening. Ezra and Ella chatted happily, talking about their future plans, while Jane and Johnson sat in awkward silence. "Mom, are you okay?" Ella asked, noticing the strange expression in Jane's face. Jane forced a smile. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just a little tired from the flight." Johnson cleared his throat, trying to change the subject. "So, Ella, Ezra tells me you are studying architecture. That's impressive." Ella smiled. "Yes, I love it. I have always been interested in designing buildings and spaces." Johnson nodded, trying to focus on the conversation, but his mind kept drifting back to the past. He couldn't believe that this was happening, that the woman he had once been involved with was now sitting in his living room, and her daughter was about to become his daughter-in-law. As the evening went on, the tension between Jane and Johnson became more and more noticeable. Ezra's mother noticed too and glanced at her husband, wondering what was going on. But she decided not to say anything, not wanting to make the situation even more uncomfortable. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, it was time for them to head to their hotel. Ezra's parents walked them to the door, and as they said their goodbyes, Johnson couldn't resist one last look at Jane. Their eyes met again, and this time there was no mistaking the fear and uncertainty in both their gazes. "Good night," Johnson said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Good night," Jane replied, her voice trembling. As they drove away, Ella chatted excitedly about the evening, completely unaware of the turmoil her mother was going through. Jane barely had a word, her mind racing with thoughts of what this could mean for her daughter's future. She knew that sooner or later the truth would have to come out, and when it did, it would change everything. The next morning, the sun rose over the peaceful neighborhood, casting a warm glow over the streets and houses. But inside the hotel room where Jane, Ella, and Ezra were staying, the atmosphere was far from peaceful. Jane had hardly slept, her mind racing with the events of the previous night. She knew that the secret she had kept buried for so many years was about to come out, and the thought of it made her feel sick with fear. Ella and Ezra, on the other hand, were oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface. They had woken up early, excited about the day ahead. Today was the day they planned to sit down with Ezra's family and begin discussing their marriage plans. Ella had been dreaming of this moment for months, and she was eager to start planning her future with the man she loved. As they got ready, Ella noticed that her mother seemed unusually quiet. "Mom, are you feeling okay?" she asked, concerned. Jane forced a smile, trying to hide her anxiety. "I'm fine, Ella. Just a little tired, that's all." Ella frowned, not entirely convinced. "Are you sure? You don't look well." Jane nodded, not trusting herself to say more. She didn't want to worry Ella, especially not today. But deep down, she knew that there was no avoiding what was about to happen. After breakfast, they made their way to Ezra's parents' house. The drive was quiet, with Ella and Ezra chatting occasionally. But Jane remained silent, lost in her thoughts. When they arrived, Ezra's parents were waiting for them in the living room. Johnson greeted them with a strained smile, while Ezra's mother, unaware of the tension, welcomed them warmly. "Good morning," Ezra's mother said cheerfully. "Did you all sleep well?" "Yes, thank you," Ella said, smiling. But as she looked at her mother, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. They all sat down, and for a moment there was an awkward silence. Ella noticed that her mother and Johnson was avoiding each other's gaze, and it made her uneasy. She turned to Ezra, who was also starting to sense that something was wrong. Ezra cleared his throat, trying to break the tension. "So, we were thinking we could start discussing the wedding plans today. Maybe we could set a date and start organizing everything." Ella nodded eagerly. "Yes, I can't wait to start planning. It's going to be so beautiful." But before they could continue, Johnson suddenly spoke up, his voice tight with emotion. "Ezra, Ella, there is something we need to talk about." Ezra frowned, puzzled by his father's tone. "What is it, Dad?" Johnson glanced at Jane, who looked pale and frightened. "There is something you both need to know," he said slowly. "Something that your mother and I have kept hidden for a long time." Ella's heart started to race. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jane took a deep breath, feeling like the walls were closing on her. She had hoped that this day would never come, but now that it was here, she knew she couldn't run from it any longer. "Ezra," Johnson began, his voice shaky. "There is no easy way to say this, but Jane and I, we were involved with each other many years ago." Ezra's eyes widened in shock. "What? What are you talking about?" Ella turned to her mother, her face pale with disbelief. "Mom, is this true?" Jane nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "Yes, Ella, it's true. It was a long time ago, before you were born. I never meant for you to find out like this." Ezra was stunned. "So, you two had an affair? Behind my mother's back?" Johnson looked down, unable to meet his son's eyes. "Yes, we did. It was a mistake, and I have regretted it every day since." Ella felt like the ground had been pulled out from under her. "How could you keep something like this from us? How could you lie to us all these years?" Jane reached out to her daughter, but Ella pulled away, her eyes filled with hurt and anger. "Ella, please, try to understand. I was young and I made a terrible mistake, but it was over before you were born. I never wanted you to know. Ezra shook his head, trying to process what he had just heard. I can't believe this. How could you do this to mom? And how could you keep it from us? Johnson finally looked up, his eyes filled with regret. I never wanted to hurt anyone, especially not you, Ezra. But it happened, and I have to live with the consequences. Ella felt tears streaming down her eyes. This is unbelievable. How are we supposed to move forward now? How can we ever trust you both? Jane sobbed, her heart breaking at the sight of her daughter's pain. I'm so sorry, Ella. I never wanted you to be hurt by this. Ezra stood up, his hands clenched into fists. This changes everything. How can we even think about getting married now? Our whole relationship is built on a lie. Ella looked at Ezra, her heart aching with the realization that everything she thought she knew was falling apart. Ezra, I don't know what to say. I don't know how to make this right. Ezra turned away, his mind racing. He had never felt so betrayed in his life. The woman he loved, the woman he was planning to spend the rest of his life with, was connected to the darkest secrets of his father's past. Johnson tried to speak, but his voice was choked with emotion. Ezra, Ella, please don't let this destroy what you have. I know we have made mistakes, but you two deserve to be happy. Ezra shook his head, his eyes filled with anger and hurt. How can we be happy when everything we thought we knew is a lie? How can we move forward when there is this dark cloud hanging over us? Ella wiped her tears, trying to find some way to salvage their relationship. Ezra, we can't let this ruin everything. We have been through so much together. We can get through this together. But Ezra was too hot to listen. I need some time to think. He said, his voice cold. I can't deal with this right now. With that, Ezra turned and walked out of the room, leaving Ella standing there devastated. She watched him go, feeling like the world was crumbling around her. Ezra's mother was overwhelmed by their confession, and she angrily walked away to talk to her son. Jane and Johnson were left sitting in silence, the weight of their past mistakes hanging heavily in the air. They had hoped that their secret would stay buried forever, but now it was out. They could only watch as their children struggled to pick up the pieces. As Ella stood there, her heart aching with the pain of betrayal, she wondered how they would ever move forward from this. The future she had dreamed of with Ezra now seemed uncertain, and she was left with nothing but questions and doubts. After some time, Jane said she had one more confession to make. Ezra and his mother returned to the living room with Ella. They sat down. Jane stood up, tears welling up in her eyes. I'm sorry, Johnson, but I believe that Ella and Ezra, they might be siblings. The room fell into a stunned silence again. Ella's face drained of color as she stared at her mother in disbelief. Ezra, on the other hand, looked like he had been struck by lightning. No, no, that can't be true. There is no way. Ezra's mother, who had been silent up until this point, finally spoke, her voice full of concern. Jane, are you saying that you believe my husband is Ella's father? Jane nodded slowly. Yes, I do. The timelines match. And well, when I look at Ella, sometimes I see a resemblance to Johnson. Ella felt like the world was spinning around her. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. All this time, the man she loved, the man she was planning to marry, could be her brother. It was too much to process. Johnson, still in shock, shook his head. No, this is impossible. Well, there is only one way to be sure. We need to do a DNA test. Ezra's mother agreed immediately. Yes, we need to know the truth. If there is even a chance that Ezra and Ella are siblings, we need to find out now. Ella's voice was barely above a whisper as she looked at her mother, tears streaming down her eyes. Mom, how could you do this to me? How could you keep this from me? Jane's heart broke at the sight of her daughter's pain. I'm sorry, Ella. I never imagined that something like this would happen. I thought I had left that part of my life behind me. Ezra was too stunned to speak. He couldn't believe that the woman he loved might actually be his sister. It felt like a nightmare, one he desperately wanted to wake up from. The decision was made quickly. The DNA test was arranged for the next day, and the rest of the day passed in a haze of fear and anxiety. Ella and Ezra couldn't bring themselves to speak to each other, and the silence between them was deafening. The next morning, they all went to the clinic. The test was conducted in silence, and the waiting was excruciating. When the results finally came in, no one wanted to be the first to open the envelope. Johnson took a deep breath and opened the envelope with trembling hands. As he read the result, his face wasn't ashamed. It's positive. The room erupted in gasps and cries of disbelief. Ella collapsed into a chair, sobbing uncontrollably. Ezra sat beside her, his face pale and his eyes wide with shock. "This can't be happening," he whispered. "This can't be real." Jane covered her mouth with her hand, tears streaming down her face. She had hoped, against all odds, that the test would prove her wrong, but now the truth was staring at her in the face. She had ruined everything. Johnson, too, was in a state of shock. He had never imagined that his affair all those years ago would lead to something like this. His wife looked at him with a mixture of anger and heartbreak. "How could you, Johnson? How could you do this to our family?" He had no answer. The guilt weighed heavily on him as he realized the full extent of the damage he had caused. Ella looked up at her mother, her voice broken. "This is why Dad divorced you, isn't it? He found out about your affair, didn't he?" Jane nodded, her heart heavy with regret. "Yes, Ella, that's why he left. I made a terrible mistake, and now it's come back to haunt us." The reality of the situation hit them all like a ton of bricks. The marriage plans were immediately cancelled, and Ella and Jane made arrangements to return to Lagos. Ezra's mother insisted that they leave as soon as possible, unable to bear the thought of what had been revealed. As they packed their bags, Ella couldn't stop crying. The future she had imagined, the life she had dreamed of with Ezra, was gone. She couldn't believe that the man she had loved was actually her brother. The flight back to Lagos was somber and quiet. Jane sat beside her daughter, wishing there was something she could say to make things better, but knowing that nothing could fix the damage that had been done. When they arrived back in Lagos, Ella went straight to her room and closed the door. She needed time to process everything that had happened, to come to terms with the fact that her life had been turned upside down in a matter of days. Jane, too, was left to reflect on the choices she had made and the consequences they had brought. She knew that she would have to live with the guilt for the rest of her life, but she also knew that she needed to be there for Ella, to help her daughter heal from the pain of losing not just a fiancé, but also the trust she had in her own mother. As the days passed, Ella and Jane began to talk more about what had happened. Ella learned more about her father and the reason behind his decision to leave. She realized that the pain she was feeling now was something her father had gone through years ago, and she began to understand the depth of his hurt. Weeks passed, and the pain that once felt so sharp began to dull. Time has a way of healing even the deepest wounds. And while the scars remained, everyone involved started to move forward. Ella and Ezra, who had once been so heartbroken and confused, found a new kind of relationship, one built on the knowledge that they were siblings. It wasn't easy at first, but they both knew it was the only way forward. Ezra had taken some time to process everything that had happened. The shock of discovering that the woman he had loved was actually his sister had been overwhelming, but he had come to terms with it. He knew that Ella wasn't to blame, and neither was he. It was their parents' choices that had led to this situation, and he had to find a way to make peace with that. Meanwhile, Ella struggled with her own emotions as well. She had gone through so many feelings: anger, sadness, betrayal, but eventually, she realized that holding on to those feelings would only keep her from moving forward. She began to focus on her studies again. throwing herself into her work at the university, and gradually, the weight of the past started to lift. Johnson, on the other hand, couldn't shake the guilt that had been eating away at him since that fateful day when the truth had come out. He knew that he had not only hurt his son, but had also shattered the lives of everyone involved. He had never meant for any of this to happen, and now all he could do was try to make amends. One evening, after a long day at work, Johnson sat down with Ezra to talk. "Son," he began, his voice heavy with regret, "I want to apologize for everything that happened. I never imagined that my past would come back to hurt you like this. I'm so sorry for ruining your marriage plans and for the pain I have caused." Ezra looked at his father, seeing the sorrow in his eyes. He had been angry at first, but over time, he had come to understand that his father was only human, capable of making mistakes just like anyone else. "Dad," Ezra said softly, "I appreciate your apology. It's been a tough time for all of us, but I have come to realize that what's important now is how to move forward. Ella and I have talked, and we have decided that we want to be in each other's lives as siblings. We can't change what happened, but we can decide how we deal with it." Johnson felt a wave of relief wash over him. "I'm so glad to hear that, Ezra. I know it won't be easy, but I'm proud of you for finding a way to move on. I have been thinking maybe we should go to Lagos and apologize to Ella and her mother in person. I think it will be the right thing to do." Ezra nodded in agreement. "I think that's a good idea, Dad. It would be good for all of us to have some closure." A few days later, Johnson and Ezra boarded a plane to Lagos. The flight was long, giving Johnson plenty of time to reflect on everything that had happened. He knew that facing Jane and Ella wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to make things right. When they arrived in Lagos, Johnson contacted Jane to arrange a meeting. Jane was surprised to hear from him, but she agreed to meet him and Ella. They decided to meet at a quiet cafe, a place where they could talk without being disturbed. As they sat down together, the atmosphere was tense at first. Jane wasn't sure what to expect, and Ella was still processing the idea of seeing Johnson again after everything that had happened. But Mr. Johnson, sensing their unease, spoke up first. "Thank you for meeting with us," he began, looking both Jane and Ella in the eyes. "I know that what happened was devastating for all of us, and I want to start by saying how truly sorry I am. I never wanted any of this to happen, and I wish I could take back all the hurt I have caused." Jane nodded, her expression softening slightly. "It was a difficult time for everyone," she admitted, "but we have all had time to think, and I believe it's important for us to move on. I accept your apology, Johnson. We can't change the past, but we can choose to heal and move forward." Ella, who had been quiet up until this point, finally spoke. "I appreciate your apology as well. It's been hard, but I have realized that holding on to anger won't help any of us. I want to be able to move forward with my life, and I think this is a good step." The conversation that followed was filled with relief and understanding. They talked about everything that had happened, clearing the air and finding a way to come to terms with the past. By the end of the evening, there was a sense of peace that had been missing for so long. As they prepared to leave, Johnson had an idea. "I've been thinking," he said, "maybe we should have a reconciliation party, a way to celebrate the fact that we have all been able to move past this and start afresh." Jane smiled at the idea. "I think that's a wonderful idea, Johnson. It would be a good way to bring everyone together and celebrate how far we have come." Ella agreed, same with Ezra, feeling a sense of closure that they hadn't expected. "Yes, I think that would be nice," Ella said. "We could invite all our family and friends and just have a good time." Plans for the party were quickly set into motion. They decided to host it at a beautiful venue in Lagos, a place that would be perfect for the celebration. Invitations were sent out, and before long, the big day arrived. Ezra's mother, too, arrived in Nigeria. The reconciliation party was a resounding success. The venue was decorated with flowers and lights, creating a warm and welcoming atmosphere. Guests mingled and chatted, enjoying the food and drinks that had been carefully prepared for the occasion. Ella and Ezra, now comfortable in their new roles as siblings, were the center of attention. Everyone was relieved to see them happy and at peace. And they spent the evening catching up with friends and family, grateful for the support they had received during such a difficult time. Jane and Johnson too felt a sense of peace as they watched their children together. They had both made mistakes in the past, but now they were focused on building a better future. They knew that they would always be connected through their children, and they were determined to make that connection a positive one. As the night drew to a close, Johnson took the microphone and thanked everyone for coming. Tonight is a celebration of forgiveness and moving forward, he said. We have all been through a lot, but I'm grateful that we have been able to come together and find a way to heal. Thank you all for being here and for being a part of this journey with us. The crowd erupted into applause, and the party continued long into the night. There was laughter, dancing, and a sense of joy that filled the air. It was a night that none of them would ever forget. A night that marked the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. As Ella and Jane returned home that night, they both felt lighter, as if a great burden had been lifted from their shoulders. They knew that the road ahead would still have its challenges, but they were ready to face them together with the support of their family and friends. This story teaches us that even when people make big mistakes, it's important to try to understand and forgive them. Even if things seemed really bad at first, talking and working together can help fix problems. Family is special, and by being kind and honest, we can make things better, even when it seems like it's too late. Once upon a time, in the bustling city of Lagos, a hardworking single mother named Charity lived with her daughter Udra. They shared a small but cozy apartment in a tall building. Their home wasn't big, but it was full of love and warmth. Charity worked as a secretary in a busy office, and her days were long and tiring. But no matter how exhausting her job was, she always made time for Udrak. Udrak had just graduated from university, a big achievement that made Charity very proud. She had worked hard to support Udrak's education, saving every naira she could and often sacrificing her own needs to ensure Udrak had everything she needed for school. The two of them had always been very close, and Charity's love and support had helped Udrak reach this important milestone. One evening, after Charity came home from a long day at work, she found Udrak sitting at the kitchen table, holding her graduation certificate. Udrak's face was lit up with a big smile. "Mom, look at this," she said, waving the diploma excitedly. Charity came over and hugged Udrak tightly. "Oh, Udrak, I'm so proud of you. You have worked so hard, and now you have graduated. It's a wonderful achievement." Udrak's eyes sparkled with joy. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mom. You sacrificed so much for me." Charity smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "We did it together. Now, we just have to keep moving forward." But as the days turned into weeks, Udrak faced a new challenge. Despite her graduation, she struggled to find a job. Every day, she searched through job listings, sent out applications, and went to interviews. But the job offers didn't come. One evening, Udrak slumped onto the sofa, looking worried and tired. "Mom, I have been applying for so many jobs, but I haven't heard back from any of them. I'm really starting to get frustrated." Charity sat down next to her and gently placed her hand on Udrak's. "I know it's tough, Udrak. It can be hard to find a job, especially with so many people looking for work. But don't lose hope. You have got the skills and the education. The right job will come along soon." Udrak sighed and looked down at her laptop. "I just wish things would get better. I want to help out and do something meaningful." Charity gave Udrak a reassuring smile. You will find something, sweetheart. You have always been determined and hardworking. The right opportunity will come. It might just take a little more time. Charity's own heart was heavy with concern. Their apartment was small, and they had to be careful with their money. The bills were piling up, and Charity worried about Odrak's future. Despite their modest living conditions, she wanted to see her daughter succeed and have a stable life. One day, as Charity was making dinner, she noticed Udrak looking through job ads again. Udrak, have you thought about exploring more job opportunities or reaching out to any of the contacts you have made? Charity suggested. Udrak looked up, her face thoughtful. I have been applying everywhere I can, but it seems like there are so many applicants for each job. I'm trying to stay positive, but it's hard. Charity nodded sympathetically. I understand. It's a tough job market right now, but I believe in you. Keep applying and don't give up. Sometimes it takes a bit longer, but the right job will come. Udrak gave her mother a small smile. Thanks, Mom. I'm trying to stay hopeful. It's just been really challenging. Charity was glad to see her daughter's spirit lifted, even if it's just a little. You have got the right attitude. We will keep hoping for the best. And remember, you are not alone in this. I'm here to support you no matter what. As the weeks went by, Charity and Udrak continued to support each other. They shared their hopes and worries, knowing that they were in this together. Even though Udrak's job search was still ongoing, she didn't lose her determination. She kept applying to various positions and attending interviews, hoping that something would eventually come true. Despite all these challenges they faced, Charity and Udrak remained hopeful. They knew that their bond was strong and that they had each other to rely on. Despite the uncertainty and the strain of Udrak's unemployment, they faced each day with determination and optimism. One day, a wealthy and charming businessman named Mr. Victor started showing a lot of interest in their lives. He was a well-dressed man who drove a sleek, expensive car and always seemed to be in good mood. Mr. Victor had a way of making people feel important, and he enjoyed visiting Charity and Odrak frequently. Mr. Victor would bring gifts whenever he came to their apartment. Sometimes he would bring flowers for Charity or sweet and small treats. He would stay for dinner and engage in lively conversations, always with a smile on his face. During his visits, Mr. Victor would often find a way to talk to Udrak. He would compliment her on her education and speak highly of her future. However, Udrak wasn't very fond of him. She felt uncomfortable around him and didn't like the way he always seemed to be trying to win her over. One day, after Mr. Victor had left, Charity and Udrak were cleaning up after dinner. Udrak looked at her mother with a curious expression. Mom, why does Mr. Victor come by so often? He always seems so eager to talk to me. Charity sighed and took a deep breath. Well, Udrak, Mr. Victor is a very wealthy and successful businessman. He's shown a lot of interest in our family, and he's been very generous with his gifts. Udrak nodded, still unsure. Yes, I have noticed. But why does he want to talk to me so much? I don't really understand his intentions. Charity looked thoughtful. Mr. Victor has mentioned several times how he could help us if you agree to marry him. He's made it clear that he can provide a comfortable life for us. Udrak's eyes widened in surprise. Marry him? Mom, that's so sudden. I don't even know him well, and I'm not interested in getting married right now. Charity put her hand on Udrak's shoulder. I understand, sweetheart, but think about it. Mr. Victor is offering us a chance to live a better life. He's promised to take good care of us, and that means you won't have to keep searching for a job. Odrak looked conflicted. I know it sounds like a good opportunity, but I don't want to marry someone just because it will make our lives easier. I want to find a job on my own and make my own way. Charity smiled gently. I appreciate that, Odrak, I do. But I also want you to think about the future. We have been struggling, and this could be a chance for us to have a more comfortable life. Mr. Victor is a kind man, and he really seems to care about us. Udoak sighed. I'll think about it, Mom. But right now, I just want to focus on finding a job. The next day, Charity made a special dinner, something she hadn't cooked in a while. She wanted it to be a nice surprise for Udrak. When Udrak came home, she was tired from another long day of job searching, but she was pleasantly surprised to see a delicious meal set on the table. Charity smiled warmly. I made your favorite dinner tonight, Udrak. I thought we could have a nice meal together and talk. Udrak sat down at the table and began to eat. This is wonderful, Mom. Thank you. I'm really hungry after today. Charity looked at Udrak with a thoughtful expression. Udrak, there is something I want to ask. I know you have been working hard to find a job, and I admire your determination. But Mr. Victor, have you considered what I told you yesterday? Udrak raised an eyebrow. Mom, Mr. Victor again. Can I at least eat food? Charity took a deep breath. He's been very clear that he can offer us a better life. He has expressed his interest in marrying you and has promised that if you agree, he will provide us with financial security. He says you won't have to worry about looking for a job or struggling anymore. He can change our lives for the better. Odwak's fork paused midway. Wait, are you saying that Mr. Victor wants to marry me just to help us? Charity nodded. Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. He's very serious about this, so he believes that marrying him would solve many of our problems and give us a comfortable life. Udoak put down her fork and looked at her mother, feeling overwhelmed. Mom, I don't know what to say. This is also sudden. I have been focused on finding a job, and now you are telling me about marriage. Charity reached across the table and took Udrak's hand. I know it's a lot to take in. I just want you to consider it. Mr. Victor is offering us a chance to have a more stable and comfortable life. He has promised that if you agree to marry him, he will make sure we live well and won't have to struggle again. Udoak looked thoughtful, her mind racing with the implications of her mother's words. I appreciate what you are saying, Mom, and I understand that this could be a good opportunity for us. But I need some time to think about it. I don't want to rush into anything. Charity nodded understandably. Of course, of course. Take all the time you need. I just wanted to make sure you were aware of the offer and the potential benefits. I'm here to support you, whatever you decide. Udoak thanked her mother and finished her dinner in silence, her thoughts consumed by the unexpected proposal. She knew her mother was only trying to help, but she felt conflicted. The idea of marrying someone she barely knew, just for the sake of a better life, was a lot to process. As Udoak cleared the table, Charity looked on with a mixture of hope and concern. She had promised Mr. Victor that she would talk to Udrak and convince her. She saw this as a potential opportunity for Udrak to secure a comfortable future, because that's all she cared about. The evening ended. Meanwhile, Charity hoped that Udrak would see the potential benefits of the offer and make a choice that would bring them both a better life. The morning sun filtered through the small windows of the apartment, casting a soft light on the modest furniture. Charity was already awake, her mind preoccupied with thoughts of the conversation she had with Udra the night before. She had hoped that her daughter would see reason and consider Mr. Victor's proposal as a golden opportunity for a better life. But the uncertainty in Udra's eyes had left her feeling restless. As the smell of breakfast filled the air, Udrak walked into the kitchen, her hair still a bit messy from sleep. She greeted her mother with a soft smile. Good morning, Mom. But there was a tension in the air that neither of them could ignore. Charity served Udrak a plate of food and sat across from her at the small kitchen table. She hesitated for a moment, then decided to bring up the subject that had been on her mind since last night. Udrak, Charity began, her mind calm but serious. Have you thought about what I told you last night? About Mr. Victor's proposal? Udrak looked down at the plate, pushing the food around with her fork. She had indeed thought about it, but the more she did, the more she realized how much she disliked the idea. Finally, she looked up at her mother and took a deep breath. Mom, I've thought about it, but I don't think marrying Mr. Victor is the right thing for me, Udrak said carefully. I want to keep looking for jobs. I don't want to be under a man who thinks we can make it on our own. And to be honest, I don't even love Mr. Victor. Charity's expression changed in an instant. Her eyes narrowed, and her voice, which had been calm just moments before, turned sharp. Udrak, you and I will have serious problems if you don't marry Victor, she said, her tone filled with anger. After everything I have done for you, this is how you want to pay me back? You don't want our destiny helper to help because of your stubborn attitude? Udrak was taken aback by her mother's sudden outburst. She had never seen her mother so upset, and it made her feel even more conflicted. But she knew she couldn't give up on her dreams without a fight. Mom, Udrak replied, trying to stay calm. I have dreams. I want to build my own company someday. I don't want to be a housewife. And to crown it all, I don't even like Mr. Victor. How can I marry someone I don't love? Charity's eyes flashed with frustration. You are talking about dreams, but dreams don't put food on the table, she shouted. You think it's easy out there? Victor is offering you a life that people only dream of, and you are turning it down because you want to build your own company. You are being selfish, Udrak. You are thinking only about yourself, not about the sacrifices I have made for you. The argument between mother and daughter grew more intense, each word sharpening the divide between them. Udrak's heart ached as she listened to her mother's angry words, but she couldn't bring herself to agree to something that felt so wrong. Finally, Charity stood up from the table, her hands shaking with anger. If you don't marry Victor, she said, her voice trembling, I will disown you, Udrak. Do you hear me? You would better get ready, because I've already fixed a date for when I will hand you over to Victor. I'm doing this for your own good, even if you don't see it now. Udrak sat in stunned silence as her mother's words sank in. Disown her? Could her mother really mean that? Charity had always been her source of strength, the person she could rely on no matter what. But now, it seemed that their bond was being torn apart by this impossible decision. I I will do it, Mom, Udrak finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. But only because I don't have a job and no other choice. Please understand that I don't love him and I don't want this. Charity's expression softened slightly, but the tension in the room remained thick. You will see, Udrak, she said, her voice quieter now. Once you are married, you will realize that This is the best decision for the both of us. Victor will take care of you, and you won't have to worry about anything anymore. Udra nodded, but her heart wasn't in it. She had agreed to marry Mr. Victor, but every part of her was screaming that it was a mistake. Still, what choice did she have? Without a job, she felt trapped, and her mother's determination left her with no room to argue. As the day wore on, Udra's thoughts were consumed by the argument with her mother. Charity, meanwhile, was already making plans to bring Udrak and Mr. Victor closer together. She arranged for them to go on dates, hoping that the more time Udrak spent with him, the more she would warm up to the idea of marriage. But Udrak was only playing along. Each time Victor took her out, he would shower her with gifts, clothes, jewelry, even a new phone. He was always polite and charming, but Udra couldn't shake the feeling of discomfort that settled over her whenever they were together. Victor would talk about his business ventures, his plans for the future, and how he could make Udra's life easier. But Udra's mind was always elsewhere, thinking about her dreams, her desire to build something of her own. She would nod and say, "Thank you," but she never really engaged in the conversations. She just wanted to get through the date and return home as quickly as possible. Victor noticed Udra's lack of enthusiasm, but he believed that with time, she would come to appreciate everything he was offering. Charity, too, was confident that Udrak would eventually come around. She continued to arrange more dates, hoping that the repeated exposure to Victor's wealth and generosity would change her daughter's mind. But Udrak remained distant, going through the motions but never truly connecting with Victor. Each outing felt like a chore, a reminder of the life she was being forced into. She smiled politely, said all the right things, but her heart was never in it. All she could think about was when she could be back in the safety of her own home. The tension between mother and daughter grew with each passing day as Udrak struggled with the reality of her situation. She felt like she was losing herself, her dreams slipping away with every forced smile and polite thank you. Charity, however, saw only the potential for a better life and continued to push Udrak towards the marriage, believing that it was the best choice for their future. And so, the days went on, with Udrak playing the part of the obedient daughter, even as her heart longed for something more. As days turned into weeks, Udrak's life became a blur of uncomfortable outings with Mr. Victor and increasingly tense conversation with her mother. Charity was more determined than ever to see her daughter married off to the wealthy businessman, convinced that it was the only way for them to secure a better future. One morning, as Udrak prepared to go out on yet another date with Mr. Victor, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of dread. She stood in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection, and wondered how her life had come to this. The dream of building her own company seemed to be fading away, replaced by the harsh reality of a life she didn't want. When Udrak walked into the living room, Charity was there, waiting with a smile. "You look so beautiful, my dear Udrak," she said, her eyes filled with pride. "I'm sure Mr. Victor will be very pleased." Udrak forced a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Thanks, Mom," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'll be back later." As Udrak left the apartment, her mind was filled with thoughts of the argument she had with her mother just a few weeks earlier. The memory of Charity's harsh words still stung, but Udrak knew there was no turning back now. She had agreed to marry Mr. Victor, and that was the path she was on, whether she liked it or not. The date with Mr. Victor went as expected. He took Udrak to a fancy restaurant, ordered the most expensive dishes, and spent the evening talking about his business and how he could provide for her. Udrak listened politely, nodding at the right moment and thanking him for the gift he had brought along. But no matter how hard she tried, Udrak couldn't bring herself to care about the things Victor was saying. She didn't love him, and the idea of spending the rest of her life with him filled her with a sense of hopelessness. Victor, unaware of Udrak's inner turmoil, continued to shower her with compliments and gifts, convinced that he was winning her over. He was a man who was used to getting what he wanted, and he believed that Udrak would soon come to see things his way. After the date, Victor drove Udrak home, and as they reached the apartment building, he turned to her with a smile. I had a wonderful time today, Udrak, he said, his voice warm and sincere. I'm looking forward to our future together. Udrak forced another smile and nodded. Thank you, Mr. Victor. I appreciate everything you have done for me. Victor reached out and gently took her hand. Please call me Victor. We are going to spend the rest of our lives together after all. Udrak felt her heart sink at the words but managed to keep her expression neutral. Okay, Victor. Victor's smile widened. That night, Udrak sat in her room lost in thought. She can't let her dream die just because of a man she barely knew. She made up her mind to go back to her job hunting. After a week, she received a call from a company that she applied for a few months back. Happily, she accepted the job and started working without her mother and Victor's consent. Udrak had finally landed a job despite Victor's insistence that she shouldn't work once they got married. It was a job at a big prestigious firm where she worked as a secretary. Udrak was excited about this new chapter in her life, feeling a sense of accomplishment and independence. She wanted to build something for herself, and this job was her first step towards that dream. However, Victor was not pleased at all. He had made it clear from the beginning that he didn't want Udrak to work. When we get married, you wouldn't need to work, Victor had told her, trying to convince her to stay at home. But Udrak wasn't interested in a life where she had to depend entirely on a man. Why shouldn't I work? She asked him, her tone firm and determined. I want to build something for myself. Victor couldn't understand why Udrak was so insistent on working. He thought he was offering her an easy life, but to Udrak, it felt like a cage. She wanted to be more than just a wife. She had dreams of her own, dreams that she wasn't willing to give up for anyone, not even for Victor. As Udrak settled into her new job, she began to distance herself from Victor. The nature of her work kept her busy, and she found herself not answering his calls as often as before. Victor, on the other hand, was growing increasingly frustrated. He didn't like the fact that Udrak wasn't paying him the attention she used to. It made him feel like he was losing control over her. One evening, after a long day at work, Udrak returned home to find Victor sitting in the living room with her mother, Charity. The moment he saw her, he sprang to his feet and started shouting, Why haven't you been answering my calls, Udrak? What kind of behavior is this? Udrak, surprised by his sudden outburst, tried to explain. Victor, I have been busy at work. I don't always have time to answer my phone. But Victor wasn't satisfied with her answer. You should quit that job, he demanded. I have told you before, I don't want my wife working. I can take care of everything. Udrak took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. I can't stop working, Victor, she replied firmly. I want to build something for myself. I don't want to depend on anyone. Victor, feeling his control slip away, started to boast about how much he could provide for her. Do you know how many women would be grateful to have what I'm offering you? You should be thankful. Udrak didn't flinch. Victor, This is not about money or what you can give me. This is about my dreams and my future. Realizing that Udrak wasn't going to change her mind, Victor turned to Charity, hoping she could persuade her daughter. He began to threaten her, saying things that made Charity worried. Charity, who had believed always that marrying Victor was the best thing for Udrak, started to pressure her even more. Udrak, you have to quit this job. Her mother insisted. Victor gives us a lot of money. Why do you need to work? Just listen to me and do as I say. Udrak refused, standing her ground, but the tension between her and her mother was growing, and it was clear that Charity wasn't going to give up easily. One morning, after Udrak had gone to work, Charity decided she had to do something drastic. She was determined to make Udrak quit her job, even if it meant causing a scene. Without telling Udrak, she went to her workplace. When Charity arrived at the firm, she didn't hold back. She walked straight to the receptionist and demanded to speak with Udrak's boss. Once she was in the office, Charity started creating a mess. She accused Udrak of being irresponsible and even went as far as lying, saying that Udrak had been sacked from her previous job for stealing company gadgets. Udrak, who was called into the office, was shocked and humiliated. Mom, what are you doing? She tried to push her mother away, but Charity refused to leave. You have to stop working, Udrak. Charity shouted in front of everyone. Victor takes good care of us. Why are you trying to destroy everything? The damage was done. After Charity left, Udrak's boss called her into his office. I'm so sorry, Udrak, he said, shaking his head. We can't have someone like you working here. We don't want any trouble in our firm. Udrak's heart sank as he was told to leave the company. She went home, tears streaming down her face, feeling utterly betrayed by her mother. Why did you have to destroy my career? She cried when she saw Charity. Is it because I don't want to do what you say? Charity, unfazed by Udrak's tears, simply replied, Victor gives us a lot of money, Udrak. Why do you need to work? Just stop all this nonsense. Udrak was devastated. She wanted to leave the house, but she had nowhere to go. She felt trapped, with no choice but to stay. Days passed, and Udrak tried to find some peace within herself. She knew she had to do something, but with no job and no support, she felt hopeless. That was until a friend came to visit her one afternoon. Udrak, I heard what happened at your workplace. Her friend said sympathetically, but I think I might have found something for you. She handed Udrak a business card. It's for a nanny job. You'll be taking care of a rich man who is paralyzed. He can't move, but he can see and hear. It's not the easiest job, but it might be what you need right now. Udrak looked at the card, feeling a glimmer of hope. Thank you, she said, holding the card tightly. The next day, Udrak called the number on the card and arranged an interview. The job was with a wealthy family, and she would be taking care of a man named Abel. His mother explained the situation to Udrak. Abel had an accident a few years ago, and he hasn't been able to move since then, she said. He needs someone to take care of him, someone who can be patient and kind. Udrak felt a pang of sadness for Abel, but she was also grateful for the opportunity. She accepted the job and started working the next day. Udrak quickly adapted to her new job. Taking care of Abel was challenging, but she found comfort in the work. Abel's mother showed her what to do, and Udrak did everything with care and dedication. Abel rarely spoke, and most days he just watched as she went about her tasks. Udrak often wondered what he was thinking, but she didn't press him to talk. She simply did her job and tried to make his life as comfortable as possible. One day, after Abel had been rushed to the hospital for one of his frequent health crises, Udrak sat by his bedside, waiting for him to wake up. When he finally opened his eyes, He looked at her and, to her surprise, spoke for the first time. Thank you, he said, his voice weak but clear. Udrak was shocked. You can talk? She asked, her eyes wide with surprise. Abel nodded slowly. Yes, he replied, a faint smile on his lips. I just haven't had much to say until now. Udrak smiled back, feeling a warmth in her heart. I'm glad you are okay, she said softly. From that day on, Abel started talking more, and Udrak found herself enjoying their conversations. She was beginning to feel comfortable in her new job, finding a sense of peace that she hadn't felt in a long time. Meanwhile, her mother and Victor had no idea that she was working again, and for the first time in a long time, Udak felt like she was in control of her own life. Udak thought she was safe, keeping her job at Abel's house a secret from her mother and Victor. But it wasn't long before Charity and Victor began to grow suspicions. They noticed that Udrak often left the house and returned late, and they couldn't figure out where she was going. They decided to follow her one day, secretly tracing her steps. When they discovered that Udrak had been working as a caregiver for a sick boy named Abel, Charity was deeply troubled. Why would Udrak take such a job when she has a rich man ready to marry her? Charity wondered aloud, shaking her head in disbelief. Victor was furious. He couldn't understand why Udrak would choose to work in someone's house instead of preparing to be his wife. He decided it was time to take matters into his own hands. One evening, as Udrak was resting after a long day at work, Victor came to her house with her mother. They sat down, and Victor pulled out a small box from his pocket. Inside was a shiny ring. Udrak, Victor began, kneeling in front of her. I want to marry you. You don't need to work or worry about anything. I can take care of you. Udrak stared at the ring, feeling no excitement, only a sense of dread. She knew Victor was trying to buy her love with money, but she couldn't let herself fall into that trap. Victor, I can't marry you, she said firmly. I don't love you, and I can't marry someone who wants to control my life. Charity, seeing that Udrak was about to refuse the proposal, grew desperate. Udrak, if you don't accept this ring, you will have to leave my house immediately, she threatened, hoping to scare Udrak into agreeing. Udrak's heart ached at her mother's words, but she couldn't let fear dictate her choices. With trembling hands, she gently pushed the ring away. I'm sorry, Mom, but I can't do this. I won't marry someone just because they have money. True to her word, Udrak went inside, packed her belongings, and left the house. She had nowhere else to go, so she headed straight to Abel's house. When she arrived, she found Abel resting in his room. Seeing the sadness in her eyes, Abel asked, Udrak, what's wrong? You look troubled. Tears welled up in Udrak's eyes as she explained everything that had happened. My mother and Victor want to force me to marry him, but I can't. I don't love him, and he only wants to control me. Abel listened quietly, his heart heavy with sympathy. I don't know you were going through so much, he said softly. You did the right thing, Udrak. No one should be allowed to dictate your life. You are strong for standing up for yourself. Feeling comforted by Abel's words, Udrak smiled weakly. Thank you, Abel. I don't know what I would have done without you. From that day on, Udrak stayed at Abel's house, continuing to care for him as she had before. As time went by, Udrak became more comfortable living in Abel's house. She found peace in her new life, far from the pressures of her mother and Victor. One day, Abel's mother informed Udrak that they would be traveling out of the state for Abel's surgery. Abel's condition had improved, but he needs surgery to help him walk again. She explained, we'll be gone for a few months, but we trust you to take care of the house while we are away. Udrak nodded, grateful for their trust. Of course, I will take care of everything here. Before they left, Abel's mother offered Udrak a new opportunity. When we return, We'd like you to work for our company. You have been so dedicated to Abel, and we believe you will do well with us. You can stay in our house for as long as you want." Udrak was overwhelmed with gratitude. "Thank you so much. I will do my best." With Abel and his mother gone, Udrak focused on taking care of the house and adjusting to her new role at the company. She worked hard, determined to prove herself. Months passed, and one day, Abel returned home from his surgery. He looked healthier and stronger than before, and to Udrak's surprise, he was able to walk on his own. "Abel!" Udrak exclaimed, running to him as he walked through the door. They hugged tightly, both feeling a deep sense of joy and relief. "Thank you for everything, Udrak," Abel said, his voice full of gratitude. "I couldn't have gotten through this without you." Udrak smiled warmly, happy to see Abel doing so well. "I'm just glad you are okay." Their bond grew stronger, and they became closer as time went on. Years passed, and Udrak's life continued to improve. She had found a place where she was valued and respected, and her relationship with Abel deepened into a close friendship. But one day, something unexpected happened. Charity, Udrak's mother, found out where her daughter was staying. She arrived at Abel's house, tears streaming down her face. "Udrak, please forgive me," she cried. "I was wrong. Victor wasn't the man I thought he was. He was a ritualist, and he was looking for someone to use for his evil plans. That's why he was spending so much money on us. I heard he was killed in his apartment a few months after you left." Udrak was shocked by the news. She listened quietly as her mother continued. "I didn't know, Udrak. I was just trying to secure a good life for you. But I see now that I was wrong. Please forgive me." Udrak looked at her mother, her heart filled with mixed emotions. "Mom," she began softly, "I have already forgiven you. You are my mother, and I can't hold on to anger forever." Charity was relieved and hugged Udrak tightly. "Thank you, my daughter. I'm so sorry for everything." Udrak nodded, feeling a sense of closure. She had moved on from the past, and she was ready to embrace the future. As time went by, Udrak and Abel grew even closer. Their friendship blossomed into love, and they both realized that they were meant to be together. Abel proposed to Udrak, and this time she accepted with a heart full of joy. They got married in a beautiful ceremony, surrounded by the people they loved. Abel's mother was overjoyed to see her son happy and healthy, and Udrak's heart was filled with gratitude for the life she had built. Udrak and Abel lived happily ever after, proving that love, patience, and forgiveness can lead to a life filled with joy and fulfillment. This story teaches us that it is important to stand up for ourselves and make our own choices, even when others try to control us. Udrak didn't let anyone force her to do something she didn't want to do. She knew what was best for her and followed her heart. The story also shows us the power of forgiveness. Udrak forgave her mother, even after she tried to control her life. Forgiving others helps us to find peace and move forward. Lastly, the story reminds us that true love is not about money or control, it's about caring for each other and being kind. Thank you for watching this amazing story about Udrak on African Stories. If you liked it and felt inspired with her journey, please show your support by clicking the like button, sharing with your friends, and leaving a comment below. To see more interesting stories and learn about different cultures, subscribe to African Stories, and don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Your support means a lot and helps us bring more stories to you. Until we meet again, stay connected, stay inspired, and keep smiling.